speaker this evening is Rabbi Shabtai. Rabbi Shabtai is, I could say a longtime friend. We all laugh, but we go back to our Smicha days. We were in YU together at the time. He's now the rabbi of the Sephardic Minyan at the Boca Raton Synagogue, as well as a teacher of high school. Okay. In addition to that, Rabbi Shabtai, before returning to the Smicha to finish the Smicha, he received an MD at which one? NYU Medical School. See, that's how close we are. But I was the model for his son who was born in Florida, so we have a number of connections. But I assisted, whatever. I was the guy there. He did it. I said, okay. He set it up. He did it. But he combines, he's written many articles, and he's well versed in the realm of not just rabbinics and halakha, but of course science, and that is what he's going to talk about with us this evening. Welcome, Rabbi Shabtai.
Thank you. Well, okay, close before I begin. I can say whatever I want. So, thank you, Rabbi Billet. The topic I want to talk about is, the title is more provocative than I think the topic is can science tell us who is Jewish? And effectively what I want to do is get to a point where we can discuss, is there anything about Jewish genetics? So when you say it, it sounds cooler. When you write it, it's a J and a G. It sounds Jewish genetics, it's the same sound. But is there something called Jewish genetics? Is there anything genetically Jewish about our genes? And who really cares? Meaning, it's a nice philosophical topic to discuss, but we'll see it has actual practical ramifications. So we'll have to do a little bit of science, a little bit of Torah, and we'll see where we get to. So before we talk about what genetics is, we know that genetics is the way we transmit traits to our children, and we know that there's something called DNA. And DNA, and I apologize if I'm boring some of the doctors or traumatizing some of you by bringing me back to ninth grade biology. But, so DNA is the stuff of genetics, and humans have 46 chromosomes. Chromosomes are those little X-looking things on those images that you would have seen. Each chromosome is packed full of lots and lots and lots of DNA, and histoproteins and other things, but packed really, really, really tightly together, and it's DNA packaged. DNA is a double helix, you remember the term, meaning it's a ladder that's twisted. The DNA sequence has 4 letters. They represent 4 different nucleic acids, A, T, C, and G, and they pair precisely. A always pairs with T, C always pairs with G. All of DNA in every creature that we know is A, T, C, G, and how you put them in order. Now there are billions and billions and maybe even trillions, I don't know what the order of magnitude, we're talking a lot, of these letters in a row in the human genome. The genome is the collection of all DNA and all 46 chromosomes. And the way it works is we have 46 chromosomes, 23 you get from your father, 23 you get from your mother. They come together, and every single cell in my body has 46 chromosomes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Now, we talk about genetics, and we talk about DNA, and we can talk about how to deal with it and how to manipulate it. But we have to be aware that even back in the day, even in the time of the Gemara, written about 500 CE, they were also aware of genetics. They just didn't call it genetics, they called it heredity, meaning they knew that children looked like their parents. Often children look like their parents more so than they look like somebody else's parents. Now the reason for that is because there's something going on. There is some hereditary traits. We know that. You don't have to be able to describe it in terms of DNA and chromosomes and genes. It's sort of obvious that that goes on. But that's a knowledge that was always had. Chazal were intimately aware, as was the entire world. If you just look around and make an observation, children look like their parents. Not always, not 100%. But generally speaking, if you're going to make an observation, it's certainly true. And so Chazal note in the Gemara in Nida that they have to figure out how exactly does this work. Now remember, they know nothing about genetics. They know nothing about DNA. Even Gregor Mendel, taking you back to ninth grade biology, who did these experiments with pea plants, this was well after the time of the Gemara. But they knew, generally speaking, there's a contribution from the father and a contribution from the mother to what the kid ends up looking like. Some kids look like their mother, some kids end up looking like their father, some are a mix. So just looking around, you can make that observation, although they couldn't explain it. And so they explained that they gave a description in the Gemara in Nida, and most, even the Rishonim also, didn't have a firm grasp on what genetics is. They're a little bit more advanced already in the year 1100, 1200, 1300, but still not the same. They already assume, this is speaking in general terms, that the Gemara says that the father contributes the darker aspects of the human body. The dark of the eye, the red in the mouth, and the mother contributes the lighter aspects, the white of the eye and the whiter parts of the body on the inside. What does that exactly mean? It probably doesn't mean precisely that. That's seemingly overly simplistic, and even the Rishonim don't assume that. But the Gemara there is very important. The Gemara says that there are actually three partners in every single person. The father contributes the darker elements, the mother contributes the lighter elements, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who contributes all of those intangible elements. Personality, characteristics, that's all of Hashem's contribution to the story. Now, whether or not we can genetically identify what comes from who and exactly how this all works out, what Chazal are trying to tell us is that, look, we know the father contributes something physically, we know the mother contributes something physically, and we know that Hashem contributes something spiritually. And the Gemara describes this as a partnership, and each creation of every child is a partnership between the parents and Hashem, and we should really think of children really in that way. It's not something that, it's something where we partner with God to do this. And we'll talk about all sorts of different ways we can manipulate genetics, and we can manipulate fertility, and we can work on the fertility problems. And if you look in bioethics literature, there's a whole discussion of whether we are playing God. And usually the only people I've seen so far, maybe it tells more about my bias than about the bioethicists themselves, but the things that I read are usually people making fun of the playing God argument, then they're tearing it apart. What do you mean we're playing God? That doesn't make any sense, and they try to attack it. And the question is, well, are we, those of us who believe in God, not all these ethicists do, but those of us who believe that, not only believe that God exists, but believe that He intervenes in this world and that we're responsible to Him at some level, is there some realm that we're playing God when it comes to some of these issues? And I think the answer is no. We're not challenging God, we're partnering with God. There's a very different approach when you say, well, God made this and I'm going to change it. So the Gemara already has said, when it talks about just healing people, the Gemara says, why do I have to heal anybody? We have a source in the Torah that says, we're allowed to heal people. So the Gemara says, why do you need the Torah to tell you that? So Tosfos says, well, you may have thought that if He made you sick, what right do you have to heal yourself? And the answer of the Gemara is, of course you do. The Torah says you do, so why? But God made it, it's still a good question. If God made you sick, by what right do you have to heal yourself? So there's another Gemara that seems to answer that question very nicely. There's a story of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had this relationship with, I think, Turnus Rufus, I forget which Roman general it was. And the Roman general needs to go at it philosophically, and some of these are more explicit, more philosophical in nature. So Turnus Rufus asked Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, which is greater, man's creation or God's creation? So he's saying, he's a philosopher asking the rabbi's going to say God, because he's a man of God, and he's going to say God's creation. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi says, man's creation. He says, what kind of religious person are you? Like, what does that mean? He says, look, I know where you're going with this. This is Rabbi Billet, this probably likes it very much. So he says, I know where you're going with this. He wants to know, what about bris milah, circumcision? He says, look, if God's creation is so great, He created man uncircumcised without a bris milah. Why do you then come along and do a bris milah? If God's creation is so perfect, you believe God makes perfect things, so why are you coming along and changing it? If He wanted to get circumcised, He would have created man circumcised. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi turns around and he takes a handful of the wheat, and he looks at it and he says, which tastes better, the wheat or the cake that I have in the kitchen? I don't know, I never had a handful of wheat, but the cake tastes pretty good. The cake is good. So, what's the lesson? The Gemara ends there. What's the lesson? Well, God made the wheat, my wife made the cake. So what's the lesson? The lesson is that, no, God didn't create this world perfectly. He didn't create it completely. He created it giving us the tools to perfect it. That's our job. Rabbi Salvation writes about this in Only Man of Faith. He gave us the world, le'ovda u'leshomra. We are supposed to perfect this world. It's our task to take those natural resources and the other resources He gave us to make this world a good and better place. And so some of that is wheat. And yeah, you could eat it, but He gave it to us to turn into cake. And you're right, He gave illness, but He also gave us the knowledge and ability to create medicines and to heal each other. You're right, He created man's body in a particular way, and He gave us the mitzvah of bris milah that on some level perfects it. So yeah, when we do all of these, when we deal with all of these technological advances in fertility and all sorts of things, we're not challenging God, we're using those tools that He gave us to perfect the world. Now we're not going to go there, that's off the topic here, but is there any limit to that? Interesting question. Not for you. But we talked about, let's get back to the genetics aspect. Just to give a perspective on when we're dealing with it, it's something that bothers me all the time. And I think, no, we're using genetics, we're manipulating in a particular way, using those abilities that God gave us. And so, why do we care so much? So Chazal were aware of heredity, and they were aware, you already see in the times of the Gaonim, of even on some more chemical basis, it's something interesting they talk about, but they talk the first time this really came up was in halacha, was in the issue of paternity testing. Now, paternity testing was something that came about to try to prove who a father is, even before we could actually identify genetics. We understood what DNA was in a real coherent way. Now, again, remember, DNA is 46 chromosomes, 23 you get from the father, 23 from the mother, and so siblings will have similar, but not exact for reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, chromosomes, right? We know that children don't look exactly like their parents because they're two parents that come together, but siblings will have more similarities among their DNA than non-siblings because they're getting from both the father and the mother and they're sharing parents. And so the closer someone is related to each other in a family way, their DNA will be more similar. Not the married, those who marry in, but the children will all be more related. Similar, we can analyze this and we can, through computational analysis, figure out how close someone is. We can really do a lot of different things. And the question was, well, could you prove that someone's father? Why do I care? So the basics of this, the first reason that this really came up was you had a woman who came to the Beit Din and she said, look, this man is my son's father. He's no longer with me. I want to pay child support. Okay? And so he says he's not my son. Now, it's easier for the woman to say he is my son than for the man to say he's not my son because she knows, she was there. She gave birth. The man was involved 9 months ago. Could there have been another man involved 9 months ago? 8 months and 29 days ago? 9 months and 1 day ago? Yeah, it's not exactly 9 months, we know that. There could have been another man involved, and how does he really know? They're not together anymore. Let's assume that was not for the most convenient and friendly of reasons. They're fighting, so how does he know? He doesn't trust her, she doesn't trust him. Who's going to pay for child support for this kid? And so they discovered there's this idea of blood testing. Well, we know that blood types, there are only 4 types of blood types. A, B, AB, and O. And there's positive and negative of each one, not for now. But there's A, B, AB, and O, and now we know we can explain that genetically, how that exactly is going to work out. But it all has to work out. Your blood type has to relate to that of your parents. So, if you have a child who is O, and the lady comes to the baby and says, this is my child, and Reuven is the father of this child, and they can test my blood type and say, look, the baby has blood type O. And Reuven, who she's saying is the father, has blood type AB. So that's not genetically possible. It's not possible. Because in order to be O, you have to have 2 O's. That's just the way it works. We're not going to get into the genetics, but you have to have 2 O's. Reuven, who's AB, can contribute either an A or a B. That's what AB means. AB means he has A and B together. So he has to give either A or B. Now this child has O and O. So Reuven clearly didn't give anything to this kid from a genetic perspective. Reuven is most certainly not the father. And we can do that just by blood testing. You don't have to actually sequence the DNA to do this. There are simpler ways to do it. But this proves that Reuven is not the father of this baby, and Reuven will therefore not have to pay child support. Okay, fine. And while that's okay, she now has to find out who will pay child support, and it's tragic for her and the child. But from a halachic perspective, we have another problem. So let's say this lady, let's say Rachel and Reuven were married, and now they're divorced, and that's why this is coming to a point in court. She's saying he's the father, he's saying I'm not the father. It turns out he is not the father. Now, they used to be married. Well, if he's not the father, and let's say they got divorced 6 months ago, the baby was born now, so the baby was conceived 9 months ago, we now have another problem. Because if Reuven's not the father, we know someone's got to be the father, and it wasn't Reuven. So now what? So you have to remember that blood testing will not tell you who is the father. It can just say who is not the father. So let's say Reuven was in fact type O, and the baby is type O. So he could be the father, but so could everybody else on the planet who's type O, which is a high percentage of people. This can just be used to exclude somebody from being the father. So Reuven will not be required to pay child support. I understand that. Someone else will, who Reuven doesn't really care. It's not him. He's not interested. However, we care. Why? Because if Reuven's not the father, that means somebody else is the father. that means that Rachel was with another man, and that this child is the product of Rachel, a married woman at the time, and a man who was not her husband. That child should be a mamzer, right? A mamzer, although we use it colloquially, but in a halachic sense, is the product of a married woman. In one case, is a married woman with a man who's not her husband, and this child should be a mamzer. So what do? Do we declare this child to be a mamzer or not? Just because we know Reuven is not the father. So the poskim at first were initially said, no, absolutely not. We don't know who the father is. All you know is that Reuven is not the father. So you can say, okay, but I don't really care who the father is, because it's not Reuven, he's a mamzer. So that's not exactly true. It's not completely true. If the child's father isn't Jewish, so then the child will not be a mamzer. That's possible. There happen to be a lot of non-Jews in this world. And so the likelihood of it being non-Jewish, just from a statistical perspective, is high. We don't know this one, but even we still have no positive idea of who the father is. Or we certainly didn't when they developed these paternity testing. Nowadays, we can do something a lot more fancy. We don't do this blood testing anymore. Blood testing used to be, they put a drop of blood, and they place the drops of blood, and you can see the agglutination test, and it's complicated. Now we can do a DNA test. We could just sequence the kid's DNA in a certain number of positions and see, is he related to Reuven? The blood test, his blood type doesn't match, and his rest of his DNA will not match, and it won't match. And so let's say Reuven says, yeah, but I have a hunch that it's Shimon. I know they're hanging out. I'm concerned that it's him. So whether or not he has to submit his DNA for this is another story. But let's say they have a sample of Shimon's DNA and we have proof that Shimon is the father from a DNA perspective. We don't know that we have no evidence that they actually slept together, but we have DNA evidence in the form of a child of Rachel and Shimon's DNA. What do we do now? Do we then declare the child to be a mamzer or not? The poskim generally assume not. We assume that we do not assume that this child is a mamzer, despite the preponderance of evidence indicating that this is a child of Rachel and Shimon. Now the reason is that we assume that a mamzer isn't just a genetic product of a married woman with another man, but the result of a prohibited relationship. Now you're telling me, how could they have had any relationship other than a prohibited relationship? You're right. The preponderance of evidence does seem to indicate that they were together, and that if they were together, that they were together while she was married, and if they were together while she was married, then it was prohibited. But nonetheless, we have no evidence, actual testimony, that they were together in a prohibited way. We are very, 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 very hesitant to ever say that anybody is a mamzer whatsoever, and therefore, generally this is assumed not to be a question of mamzerus. Now, generally speaking, there are probably only 2 or 3 people on the planet who will ever pass on any question of mamzerus anyway, because this is a serious issue. This is not something that everyday people deal with. And so, Rabbi Yosef was one of these people who would go at it and try to find 150 different reasons why we can get out of it. And so we try to get out of it because our applications are so great. The issue is though that, what do we do with the DNA evidence? It's sort of very, very clear. So you can say, yeah, look, he's the genetic product of Shimon and Rachel. Maybe they did IVF together. Maybe they didn't sleep together. Maybe they went to a fertility specialist and they did IVF. They don't know. You don't know. Could be, and since you have no proof that they were actually together in a prohibited way, maybe it was some other way, and therefore maybe that is enough. That is enough to prove that maybe that child is not a mamzer. Interesting. So that's the original source where this originally came up, but there wasn't DNA evidence at the time. DNA evidence has gotten a lot better over time. We're talking about the 50s, particularly now with the Human Genome Project. We can sequence a person's DNA. Today is right. You can buy a genome testing kit for $100 today. It's Prime Day if your the website is down. But in theory, you could.
$68.
$68 now. And you can sequence, they don't sequence your entire DNA, they sequence only parts of it, but enough of it to get a good picture of history. You have to trust them a little bit. We'll talk about that in a second, but what are they sequencing, who is sequencing, what kind of lab is it, and what are they doing? Generally, it's, people are, you do this for, curiosity reasons. You want to see where their family's from, and, where they, how they got to wherever they were from. We generally happen to know, generally among Jews, we happen to know, generally speaking, where our families are from, and depending on, where that is, how far back could you possibly go? Now remember that the closer you are in relationship, family-wise, your DNA will match. And so we can do this on mass scales, We'll talk about it a little bit more, but we can do this on a mass scale and say, all Jews from, England's a bad example, but all Moroccan Jews share a common couple of sequences in their DNA. They're not all the same, but there are more similarity among Moroccan Jews than there are among Moroccan versus Lithuanian Jews. And so we can trace it back. And it's an interesting thing to do, although there are some areas. My brother did this. He submitted it. We'll talk about it in the site, one type of that he did. My father's family comes from Afghanistan. I know them. So they said that the DNA from Afghanistan, near Iran. So they said, your DNA either matches Iran, which is more likely because Afghanistan, a lot of times people came from Iran to Afghanistan, they were Pogroms, they kept going east, that's how they got there, or Scotland. Yeah. Whatever. No. Okay? Whatever. Okay. It was like a 2% chance they're not Scottish. I'm pretty confident that it's more likely Iran. Okay, yeah, whatever. But just a note that when you do that, just from a perspective, it's something to think about that. Although we do this as a curiosity, and if you look, they're advertising this, find out where your ancestors come from, and with the World Cup just ending, the U.S. wasn't in the World Cup. So this is a really big deal from a marketing sports perspective, because Americans aren't going to watch. We're very self-interested. We will watch the U.S. play, and then there are a handful of us who will watch some other teams play, and then there are people who will not watch them. But we're not. If the U.S. was interested, and when you see the U.S. is in the game, market share of watching sports teams goes up. So how do you get people excited about the World Cup? So 23andMe came up with an ad and said, find out where your ancestors are from and root for that team. Clever, right? I mean, it's just a gimmick. It's clever. There was one ethicist who said that racism, why do you assume that there's a genetic similarity between the team? The team that you root for is completely random. I mean, why is it? I never understood this. How do you choose how to root for a team? Just because I happen to live in Florida, I'm now going to change which team I root for? I think the whole thing is sort of arbitrary anyway, so how is this any less arbitrary than it is? I don't think it's terribly racist. But, okay. But you have to remember that your DNA contains not just where it's likely that your ancestors came. It contains every single thing there is to genetically know about you. Whether or not we know what that information is today, we know that it's all there. It's all, I know, nature versus nurture, and there's all sorts of things that aren't encoded in DNA, and all that's true. But there's plenty that's encoded there, and it's not just that which we know. So, for example, out of the billions and billions and billions of base pairs of DNA, I forget what number they throw out. 90% of it is called junk DNA. Junk DNA means it doesn't do anything. So I think that's a terrible term. Junk DNA means we don't know what it does. Or we don't know today what it does. A couple of, 2-3 weeks ago already, they said, oh yeah, a whole section of that which we assume to be junk DNA actually encodes for something that happens during embryonic development. Now we don't usually study DNA, we study adults, we don't know what happens in embryonic development, and all of us, that part of the DNA isn't functional anymore. But it's important. I just don't like the term junk DNA. I feel like I have a sense of hubris, like, there's DNA that we still don't know what it does. There's DNA, tons and tons, and a very high percentage, that we share with other creatures and other animals. So why would we do that unless there was coding for something of life importance, of some level? But there is a lot there is a lot there, and we don't necessarily understand all of it. But just thinking now about Amazon Prime Day, what if, like, they knew that you had an impulsive personality, or they knew that you had this type of personality, and Google knew that, or Amazon knew that, and they could tailor the ads not just based on your 5 last purchases, but they can now tailor the ads based on what are you more likely to click on, based on your personality, based on what they know about your genetics. We don't have that ability today, but it's all there. It's all there. Just something to think about. Who has access to this? Who has access to this? Because what are their privacy policies? Their private companies. Why are they doing this? There was I saw an ad somewhere. Well, free hereditary cancer screening. We'll screen you for 8 different types of cancer, and don't worry if you have a copay or a deductible. It's all covered. I've never been to a doctor before where my copay has been covered by anybody. Yeah. The reason it's covered is because someone's footing the bill. It's not my insurance, that's for sure. Someone else is footing the bill. Someone thinks it's worth paying my insurance company $50 to get my DNA to test for 8 random cancers that doesn't make any medical sense. They say, no, you know, we have a family history. My mother passed away from colon cancer. We'll test for colon cancer. So that's absurd. That's absurd. There are so many different types of colon cancer. You're going to test me for one random type? If I had, you know, if you want to say, look, I have a sample from your relative, and if the likelihood of you having hereditary cancer that's similar to your relative is high, so it's higher than for the average person. So if I knew what sample they had, if I knew what their mutation, if I knew what cancer they had, I could then test you to see if you compare to that. But to test you for the other 17 random types, I'm making up the numbers, there's no reason that you should have any of those more than anybody else on the planet. So why are we doing that? And just think about how far we've come in terms of science. My mother passed away in 97. We don't have the sample. They never did genetics on cancer samples in 1997, even in Sloan Kettering, which was like the leading hospital in New York City at the time. Just crazy how far, that's the first thing that's done nowadays. It's just wild how far, like, in our own lifetime. Certainly my lifetime. Like, this is like, it's mind-blowing. But just something to think about, who has access to this information is really important. You're right, today I don't know what we can do with it, other than, you know, figure out if your grandparents came from Afghanistan or Scotland. That's true, but it's all there. Just think about who has access to it. And this came about recently. There was, they caught the Golden State Killer. Golden State Killer was someone who wreaked havoc in California for some long time, and they couldn't prove who it was. And so what they did was they found the DNA sample from what they presumed to be the killer, based on a tissue that they picked up in the garbage. And they had his DNA. Okay, so they have his DNA, they don't know who it is. They have his DNA. What they did was, the police submitted his DNA as him. I can submit your DNA as you. I know they can't stop me. I can take your tissue and say I want to know everything about myself. It's not me, but they don't know that. And they matched it to publicly available databases, and they found his relatives. And they said, well, if those are his relatives, so then I know who he is. And they put it all together. There was a lot of detective work involved. It was ingenious detective work to find out which among the relatives were in the right place at the right time, and that's how they caught the guy, because it was all available. Now, yes, we're not criminals and we don't want to be, I understand that, but that is one example of it being available in a public way that it can be used. Now, this was used, the next real issue in halacha came up in also a little bit more morbid way on 9/11. On 9/11, we know that over 3,000 people were killed. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that over 3,000 people were killed? Well, over 3,000 people were presumably at the World Trade Center at the time and are now missing. We didn't actually find 3,000 bodies, which makes a lot of sense. Those were tremendous buildings, there was a lot of fire, and we did not find 3,000 bodies. Now, we found parts of a lot of bodies. I went to NYU Medical School, and behind the old Bellevue Hospital was a tent that was set up. Even in 2010, 2011, it was still there, still collecting pieces and scraps from the rubble that they were going through back from 2001. So we generally have a presumption of luck. You have to remember, so what do you do if there's a man there and we presume that he died, but we don't know? So what about his wife? So a woman can get remarried. I know this is not the first thing she's thinking about when this happens, but years later, she can get remarried when her husband either dies or divorces her. Okay? So we know there was no divorce, but how do we know he died? Now, we have to remember, back in the day, this was a serious issue. There was no communication. He went off on the trip, and God only knows what happened to him. Now, he may have died. He may have found somewhere else. He may be being held hostage. We don't really know. We have no idea. This happened a lot. And so Chazal started to have to deal with this issue. What if he was with one other person? We know testimony in Judaism requires 2 witnesses. What if there's only one witness who is dead? So we'll allow it. We're very, very lenient when it comes to this, because otherwise this woman will remain in an aguna, a woman who cannot get remarried. She can't move on with her life. However, what if a passerby comes and says, yeah, I saw your husband, he was dead. How do you know it was him? And it was him. Well, I don't know, he was wearing a certain pants and had a beard. Okay? And he was dead. He was dead. Okay? That doesn't mean anything. You need something more specific. You need something that can describe that person with more specificity. And so Chazal go through this, and through the Middle Ages, through the Rishonim and Achronim Shulchan Aruch, there are tons of tshuvas written about this, because it was so very practical. How do I identify? I mean, it was unfortunately a necessity. How do I identify someone? And we have something called a siman muvhak. This is clearly, he had 6 fingers on his right hand and 6 toes on his left, and that's clearly a siman muvhak. He had a beard, so okay, I don't know, that's not exactly the same. But we have, so that's not that's a lower level. There are mid-levels. How exactly do you have to figure this out? How do you do the math? What if you have one siman mufak that it's clear, so that's going to be fine. What if you have 2 or 3 moderate simanim, so some poskim allow, it's complicated, which, how? So the poskim debate, well, okay, this siman mufak that you're talking about, this very clear sign, how rare is it? They look, it's rare, okay? You know, it's something, I'd be able to identify the guy positively. How rare does it have to be? Now it's fascinating because in the poskim, they're not really dealing with this from what we would call modern day statistics. They're saying, in fact, look, no one else in the city looks like that. Okay? Well, how big is the city? So you have 1,000 people, there's 1 million people. So they say, well, you know, no one, even 1 in 1,000 doesn't look like him. 1 in 1,000. That's kind of low. That's kind of low. They ask me, look, on the Titanic, how many people are on Titanic? It's like 3,000? Something like that? I have no idea. Let's use the number 3,000 just for the sake of clarity, so for the sake of the example. So there are 3,000 people on Titanic, and someone says, look, I saw someone, he died, I saw someone die on Titanic, and he had this specific simon. He looked like that. That must be your husband. Well, if you use the number of 1 in 1,000, no. Statistically speaking, there were 3 people on that boat who had that particular characteristic. You don't know that you saw her husband at all. You know you have a 33% chance that it was her husband. So clearly they're not trying to get at a specific statistical, number, but they're trying to give you some impression. There's a story that has to go along with it. Look, he was traveling to this city, and this is the path he was taking, and you found him on the side of the road on the way to that city, and this is what he was wearing, and this is what. So you tell a whole story that comes together. So the issue was as follows. They didn't find bodies on 9/11, or for many, many people, they didn't find the bodies, but they found parts. They found DNA evidence. So what does that prove? So DNA evidence, the DNA likelihood that I find a DNA sample, and I can find a DNA sample from all these people, meaning all the wives in the situation submitted samples from their home, hairbrushes, toothbrushes, we have DNA samples. We know it's a perfect match. The likelihood of that being off is far, far less than 1 in 1,000. It's less than 1 in 1 million. It's really, really low. The likelihood of it being off is much, much lower than any Ashron, any tshuva ever thought. So you say, okay, so this DNA evidence proves what? It doesn't prove someone died. Look, if you found the guy's vital organs, you kind of say, okay, fine, but that's not what they found. They found pieces. So now, that doesn't prove the person died. That proves the person was there. It proved the person was there. So, Rabbi Yosef has a tshuva about this. Rav Zalman from Goldberg, they were the 2 poskim who were consulted about all the cases. And they, in the end, all the women were allowed to remarry, basically following a calculation. They said, well, we can't prove that these people died, but I can prove that they were there. Right? And I know, because I have their DNA evidence there. It proves they were there, because otherwise I have the DNA evidence there. So, we also know that where they worked, that we know because the wife where they worked. There was one case, not DNA evidence related, but there was one case, it was a man, I don't know if the story is real or not, but it's an amazing story. There was a man who was in Cantor Fitzgerald, who was above where the plane hit. And apparently they said, he called his wife. At some point, cell phones were working, and cell phones were working. I don't remember who he was there. At some point, they weren't working, they stopped working, whatever. And so he was able to talk to his wife and say, look, I'm above this, we're above the plane, we don't really know what's going to happen. They didn't know what it was. They saw this was not a good situation, and he told her he was there. So he was very concerned what would happen to her. Supposedly, he therefore sent a fax to her, an e-fax or fax, that said, I hereby divorce you. He tried to give her a get so that they would be divorced, so that even if they can't find him, she wouldn't be in that mood. Now, this is an idea in the Gemara that David HaMelech instituted this before the men went off to battle, that they would all divorce their wives. Because otherwise, if he died in battle and we didn't know about it, then the wife would be stuck. So this way they're divorced and therefore they can get freed. So technically speaking, that's not a valid get. It has to be written a lot of different particulars. You can't fax a get. However, assuming the story is true, it proves, first of all, it's an amazing thing. This is what the guy was thinking at the last moment. And divorce is what? It's like, divorcing because he loves her. But it proved that he was there. And it proved that he wasn't going to make it. And so that was enough to prove that he died. And so they said the same thing with DNA evidence. The DNA evidence, beyond the shadow of a doubt, is clear that this is the person in question. And we know where they work. And we know that nobody who was above that point ever made it out. And therefore, if we can prove that he was there, and we're pretty confident, we're absolutely confident, that it's that person's DNA, therefore, they said we can be confident that these people died, and because we're confident that these people died, these women can, therefore, remarry based on the assumption that these husbands had died. So it was using the DNA evidence in that way to be very clear who a person was. The next issue that came up really with DNA evidence was a fascinating, wasn't really so Jewish, but it came up in the scientific literature when they said, well, wait a minute. So I said before, 46 chromosomes, you get 23 from the mother, 23 from the father, and there's sort of a mix, you can't really tell. So that's almost true. There are 46 chromosomes, but out of those 23 pairs, the last pair, why we call it the last pair, that's just how we put it on the diagram, the last pair is what we call the sex chromosomes. It's an X and a Y or an X and an X. That's what differentiates, that's what makes the genetic difference between a genetic male and a genetic female. Be careful how you talk nowadays. That's what makes the genetic difference between a genetic male and a genetic female. A woman has an X and an X, and a man has an X and a Y. And they get one from the father and one from the mother. So, if you do the math, every woman has 2 X's, so she must have gotten an X from her mother and an X from her father, otherwise that's the only way to end up with 2. And every man has an X and a Y. So he must have gotten his Y from his father, because his mother has no Y. So he got the Y from the father and the X from the mother. So if you realize that a man always inherits the Y chromosome from his father, we have a gene that is clearly, can always be traced back to the father, right? Because only a father can give a Y, and only his son must have gotten it from his father, etc., 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 all the way back. So he said, well, wait a minute. What if we did the following? What if we knew the sequence of Aaron HaKohen's DNA? His Y chromosome. If we knew the sequence of Aaron HaKohen's Y chromosome, we would be able to know who's a Kohen. Right? Because Aaron HaKohen, his Y chromosome was transmitted to Elazar and Itamar, not the who died, and they transmitted to Pinchas and their children, and the Y chromosome went through the generations all the way very clearly down. Now, Moshe was his brother, so their Y chromosomes are going to be very, very similar because they share the father. But eventually, particularly after so many years, the differences will be stark enough that we can actually use computational analysis and figure out who is from Aaron and who is from Moshe. So you say, okay, but we don't have Aaron HaKohen's Y chromosome. Yes, that's true. What we can do is take all the people who currently identify as Kohanim and test their Y chromosomes. And say, well, look, if of all the people who self-identify as Kohanim, 80% of them all share a couple of similarities among their Y chromosome, it's very likely that that came from Aaron HaKohen. And therefore, anybody else who should match that profile of the Y chromosome should also be considered to be a Kohen. And while that's interesting, it's not helpful. Because being a descendant of Aaron HaKohen is not the only thing that makes you into a Kohen. You have to be Jewish, for example. What if a Kohen marries a non-Jew? The Kohen marries a non-Jew, so the Y chromosome will still be the Aaron HaKohen Y chromosome, but this child is not Jewish. And you wouldn't be able to tell that by the Y chromosome. If a Kohen marries a divorcee, so his child, although technically a Kohen, doesn't let to work in the Beis HaMikdash, it's more complicated than that, because following the Y chromosome alone isn't sufficient. But what if you could do something different? Forget the Y chromosome and find the Kohanim. Okay, practically speaking, okay, who's going to get up to Duchen, and who we're going to do the Petar Chamor with. We don't really have donkeys so much, this doesn't really happen. Pidyon Aben, there are practical reasons why I care who a Kohen is. What I really, really want to know about is who's Jewish. Now we know that Judaism is transmitted through the mother. So what about, is there something that I could specifically test that's only clearly maternally transmitted? Now, X chromosomes in the man are maternally transmitted, but in the woman they're not. The X woman has 2 X chromosomes, one from the father, one from the mother. How are you going to know which is which? You're going to have a big problem. You're not going to be able to trace it. If you could then sequence Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah's DNA, would that help you then know who's Jewish? At least genetically Jewish. We're not talking about Gerim and converts who are also 100% Jewish, but you're right, the DNA analysis would not account for that. But it would mean that if someone would come and say, look, and this happens a lot. I don't know how often Rabbi really gets this. I get this a lot. Rabbi, I feel like I'm Jewish. That's a lot. And there's a story. So one story was, yeah, why? Well, Jesus came to me in a dream and told me I was Jewish. I said, that's fascinating. Okay. Like there are 50 bits off the bit. Okay. But sometimes there's a story. There's a story. He said, look, my great-grandmother, she married a non-Jew, and the mother, so she's Jewish, and she married a non-Jew, she was kicked out of the community, she moved over here, and there's a whole story. Maybe she lit candles, maybe she didn't light candles, maybe they did Yom Kippur, maybe they did. There's a story. But where are they buried? Nobody cared, nobody's religious. What are you going to do? But what if there was a way to check genetically and say, I can prove one? If I can prove that the grandmother was Jewish, the grandmother was Jewish, she's Jewish. Whether they kept Shabbos or didn't keep Shabbos, I can prove 100% that. Her DNA matches Sarah Imenu's DNA, she's Jewish. So could that exist? So not the DNA that we've been talking about. Because the DNA we've been talking about, you can't tell which comes from what, that's not going to help. However, there's something else that happens. So when fertilization occurs, the sperm and the egg come together. So I said every cell in your body has 46 chromosomes, that's also not 100% true. Because if every cell in my body had 46 chromosomes, then my children would end up having 92. Right? And their children would end up having 184. That's not going to work out. So it has to be that every single cell in the human body has 46 chromosomes except for the sex cells. Meaning the sperm and the egg, they only have 23, which makes sense. So when they come together, they make 46, which is the way it works out. Fine. So the sperm and the egg come together. The sperm has 23 chromosomes. The egg has 23 chromosomes. The nuclei, the center of the cell where the chromosomes are held, they fuse, and you end up having 46 chromosomes. It's a lot more complicated than that, but just for now. What about the other stuff in the cell? The cell has all this other stuff. Cells do things. They don't just have chromosomes. They make protein. That's what cells generally do. They make protein. There's a Golgi complex and ribosomes and lysosomes and all sorts of different things. And mitochondria make the energy. Where does that all come from? Just it's a mix. No, it turns out that everything in the cell comes from the egg. The sperm only contributes the 23 chromosomes, and that's it. Everything else in the cell, all the other, we call them organelles, all come from the egg, all come from the mom. Okay? So what? So we've discovered that the mitochondria are responsible for making energy in the cell. They got the 93, they make ATP. So mitochondria have their own set of DNA. Completely separate from the 46 chromosomes, they have what we call mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA, which are completely housed within the mitochondria and are only necessary for the mitochondria carrying out that which they need to do. They replicate on their own, has nothing to do with the other 46 chromosomes in the nucleus, it's in a completely separate place. They replicate on their own, they make their own thing, and the mitochondria use them to make mitochondrial stuff and do mitochondrial duties. Now, if the mitochondria for the rest of the cell all comes from the mom, so mitochondrial DNA also must come from the mom. So forget about sequencing Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah's DNA. I don't care about the DNA. I want to sequence Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah's mitochondrial DNA because every single one of their children, well, don't prove anything because of Yishmael and Esau, but at least let's get Rachel and Leah. At least Rachel and Leah's mitochondrial DNA will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can trace yourself back to Rachel and Leah. Right? Now, if you can, that would prove you're Jewish. Now, if you can't, it doesn't prove you're not Jewish. It doesn't prove at all. Right? It's only an in, because the person, there could be converts, there could be Gerrit, there could be all sorts of things along the way, which are 100% Jewish. Fine. It can only prove that someone is. But what about all these cases where there's a story, and it's complicated? This happens in Israel now, it's a big issue. People from the former Soviet Union will have a story, and look, communism tried to eradicate any semblance of Judaism, and so it's going to be reasonable. There are going to be a lot of these stories, and some are going to be true, and some are not going to be true, and how are you going to know? And we're assuming no one's coming, let's assume at least for the sake of argument, no one's coming and doing this maliciously. There are, true, but there's a story they don't really know. They don't know why, because that's what 70 years of communism will do. And so what do? So we don't have Rachel and Leah's mitochondrial DNA. So if we did, that would make life a lot easier. We don't. So what do? So you can do the same thing you did before. Take all of the Jews and see if there's similarities among their mitochondrial DNA, right? And then say, well, if there's such this overwhelming similarity among their mitochondrial DNA, they must be related more than other people are related. So it's a lot more complicated than that, unfortunately. It's not so simple. However, if you take small pockets of Jews, so nowadays it's a lot more complicated because we're traveling all over the world, we've all come from different places, but let's talk about, like before World War II, even leaving the United States out of it, which is sort of a melting pot, you have communities that existed in their locations for many, many years. So talk about the Bukharian Jews in Georgia, in South Russia, when they analyze their mitochondrial DNA for particular markers, over 95% of them share a common sequence. That is shared, when they did the study, I don't remember how many hundreds of people were being used, I don't know if I have the numbers here. It was 75% and 95% of Jews all have this similar sequence. When they tested it, there was only 1 or 2 non-Jews who matched, which probably means that they were actually Jews and we just didn't realize it. But that's a very high percentage. So if you're Bukharian and you match that DNA, it's very, very likely that you come from the same mother that all these people came from, because that's how they have the same mitochondrial, similar mitochondrial DNA, and therefore very likely. The issue is that not all communities were quite as secluded and closed off as Bukharian Jewry, and it's a lot more complicated. Particularly among Eastern European Jewry, which was studied a lot, it's not clear. There are a lot of different markers that we're searching for, and what if it's shared by 60% of all people, or 50% of all people, or even 40% of all Jews? If they're sharing something in common, there's probably something going on here. But what about the bunch of also non-Jews who are sharing those sequences? How do you deal with that from a statistics perspective? What does that mean? Does that mean that, how are you going to deal with it? It doesn't mean, again, if someone matches it, it doesn't mean there's a 43% chance that they're Jewish. It means that 43% of all Jews from that area happen to match a particular sequence of mitochondrial DNA. They have to know how many non-Jews in that area also match that sequence. How many people around the globe match that sequence who aren't from that area? So often that's going to be a lot less, but not necessarily so. There's a lot of statistical analysis that has to go into this to try to figure it out. But in the end of the day, the answer is yes. There, in theory, at least, could be Jewish genetics, right? Rachel and Leah's mitochondrial DNA was transmitted, and Bilhah and Zilpah, not trying to exclude them, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, all of their mitochondrial DNA is what all of the Shvatim carried, and their descendants, right? And it gets complicated, though, because not everyone's going to have it. Who did they all marry? What if they marry, and then when they're converted, meaning who did the Shvatim marry? Reuven married Echad, the Midrashim would say they married. It's complicated, but you're adding more complexity into the system. So true, but if there's a match, it means that it's, so how close is a match is a match? This is a serious issue now going on in Israel with conversions. This is something that's going on right now. And so the poskim are very, very hesitant to rely on this DNA evidence alone. I didn't see a case where it was a Bukharian case. It wasn't, not big, but in a Bukharian case where it's 95%, that's really, really high. That's something that it's very hard to say, hey, there's one or two non-Jews in the whole area that match. Like when they're Jewish, come on, those numbers are so low. But when the numbers are different, so the poskim are unwilling, go lower. We're now not playing with matching DNA anymore. We're not saying, oh, is this you? Now we're saying, are you part of a historical group who were trying to match based on computational analysis of comparing everybody's DNA? This is already a level up. And it's a lot more complicated. So the poskim generally, there was a sefer published by Rav Osher Weiss's Bezin on this topic, and they leave at the end, they're like, yep, it's a good question. What? Just read a whole sefer, I'm waiting for a conclusion. Yep, these are the issues. Okay, now I'm more acutely aware of the issues. But how do you deal with this? And so the poskim are willing to use this as evidence towards something, but not as 100%. You have to have a story as well. And often the stories are hard to know. You can't, what are you going to ask anymore? And then as the years go on, they're trying to go back, and there are all these stories of people going back to Russia, and trying to the Soviet Union, trying to figure out what the cemetery was, who lived where. It's complicated to try to prove these histories. So this is now being used as an additional element of the history, because we know that Chazal dealt with statistics all the time. Chazal dealt with statistics, it's just statistics on a different level. So, for example, we have a principle of rove in halacha. That rove, following the majority, is a statistical principle. So much so that the Gemara says that if you have 10 butcher stores in a city, and 9 of them sell kosher meat and 1 of them sells non-kosher meat, you find a piece of meat outside, so what do you do? Well, I would have told you, wait a minute. If I didn't know about rove, and I found a piece of steak and it's unidentifiable where it came from, I would have told you, wait a minute. It's either kosher or non-kosher, right? So if it's non-kosher, it's a Torah prohibition. So it's a deraisa. So I have a suffix on the deraisa level. I should be machmir. I should be stringent and not eat it. And the Gemara says, no, you're allowed to follow the rove in that case and say, no, there's a 90% chance that it's kosher and therefore you can eat it. They're willing to rely on the rove. It gets a little bit more complicated, though, that it's not complete. So you say, well, okay, so here too, if it's 60% chance that this person is Jewish, so assume that they're Jewish, no? So it gets a little bit more complicated than that. What if you find 10 pieces of meat outside? Same situation. You have 10 stores, 9 non-kosher, 1 kosher. And so you find 1 piece of meat, you say, okay, 90% chance it's kosher. You find another piece of meat, 90% chance it's kosher. You find 10 pieces of meat. Can you cook them all together? Or do you assume, no, there's a 10% chance that one of them is here not kosher? The Gemara has the same thing. What if you find a kid on the street? Doesn't have it, so you find a kid on the street. Do you know if he's Jewish or not? Find the baby. So the Gemara says, well, it depends on the city. If the city is 70% Jewish, you can assume the kid is Jewish. If it's 70% not, it's okay. So if it's 70% Jewish in the city, you can assume that the kid is Jewish. What if you have 10 such kids? Can you make a minion? What do you assume? We assume yes, you can. We assume that all 10 pieces of meat are kosher. Why? Well, from a halachic perspective, we're not looking at the whole thing together. We're looking at each one individually, and therefore you already see that what we consider to be modern statistics is starting to break down a little bit. Right? From a statistics perspective, I'm like, no, you absolutely can't cook all 10 pieces together. That's crazy. One of them isn't kosher. And I'll tell you that 4 of these kids aren't Jewish. I just don't know which. So, we'll invite them to come for shul, but I can't make a minion out of all 10 of them because 4 are for sure not going to help. No, in halacha we assume they're all fine. And so you see already in Chazal what they're playing with, because they have a different understanding of how the statistical models work. It's not right or wrong. It's just a different way of looking at the math. And so it's not just saying, well, look, if there's a 60% chance that they're a match to a Jewish group, this person's Jewish, it's Rove, come on. Well, Rove is also complicated. Statistics in halacha is more complicated than it is just looking at the straight numbers. And therefore, all of these things play in. And the modern poskim are using this as what we call a sniff, as an additional level of evidence, but not as 100% proof that a person is Jewish. Okay, we'll pause here. And
If there's any
I
questions,
have a minute and 4 seconds, 3 seconds. Otherwise, I can hang out after my if that's easier.
What you have going on in Poland today, where people who are, as children, babies, are given away to
Yeah.
their parents, how does one figure that? Because there's no
No
database.
stories. There's no database. Sometimes there's a story, sometimes there's not. It's very complicated. There's usually sad cases. When there's a story, so then it's before all of this, we just went based on the story. We just based on the story. And someone told me, yeah, they had, and people had to hide the fact that they were Jewish. I had someone said my grandmother was Jewish, but she had to hide the fact that she was Jewish because you don't want to be persecuted. So yeah, nobody knew she was Jewish, right? I mean, usually, does anyone know you were Jewish? No, nobody knew she was Jewish. She ran to another city and deliberately, let's assume it's all true, deliberately pretended to be not Jewish. It makes it very complicated. It makes these modern issues very, very complicated. Baruch Hashem, I don't have to say what they did to determine these issues. Okay, we'll pause here.
Thank you very much.